Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 45, Animal Movement. So we're nearing the home stretch here of our class, getting through this week. So this chapter, Animal Movement, will deal with the muscular system, one of my favorite systems of the body. So let's talk a little about why animals move and why it's important. So animals are stimulus and response creatures, right? So there's things in the environment that happen and animals have to respond accordingly, and one of those ways in which they respond is to move, right? So if they come into contact with something that's going to eat them, or they see something that they want to eat, they're going to move to get there or move to get away from it, right? So two types of movement where the animal is completely moving, right? So locomoting, or where one part of the animal is moving relative to the entire body. So we can see this being, just an animal stretching out a tentacle or moving its entire body to get away from something or to get towards something. Muscles and the skeletal system work together to produce movement. So your muscles pull on your bones to move. And we study this in a field called biomechanics. So I mentioned locomotion, but that is the movement of an animal on its own power. So what are some reasons that an animal would locomote? To seek food, water, mates, shelter, and to get away from predators. So how do animals locomote? They obviously can do walking, running. Okay, there's also flying and gliding. So if we're talking about, birds, obviously, or gliding squirrel, flying squirrels, glide, swimming. Okay, there's an undulating motion, which is like a back and forth motion that worms kind of do, an undulating motion in some aquatic animals, and jetting, which is what we've talked about with jellyfish as jetting to locomote. So all vertebrates share three types of muscle tissue. So there's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. We'll talk about them in some slides coming up, but basically smooth muscle is all of your involuntary, your digestive tract is lined with smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle is the heart, also involuntary. And the skeletal muscle is responsible for movement, locomotion, and that's the voluntary muscle that we pull our bones with. The muscle tissues share several properties. So the two major properties, and we'll look at, there's other ones as well, they all contract by way of something called the sliding filament theory, which we'll discuss in the second part of this lecture. And they all are electrically stimulated cells. So we talked about in the last chapter all of the electrical properties of the nervous system. Muscle cells share that property of being able to transmit an action potential. And we'll see how that's important with the transmission of acetylcholine in muscle tissue. So I mentioned voluntary versus involuntary. So voluntary muscles are your skeletal muscles. So conscious thought can cause that. You can think about it, you can move your arm, you can move your leg, you can run, you can walk. Involuntary muscles contract in response to unconscious stimuli. So these are going to be your cardiac muscle. You're not thinking about your heartbeat. Your smooth muscle in your digestive tract is all involuntary. When we look specifically at the cells, they can be multinucleate or uninucleate. So that means they can have many nuclei in them, or they can have just one nuclei. And that'll be another way we can distinguish them, which we'll see. And they can be striated or unstriated. So striated muscle is going to be your muscle that has visible kind of filaments in it, and unstriated are going to be your smooth muscle that does not have those striations. So let's look at smooth muscle first. So smooth muscle cells, if you look at them, they're pretty clearly they're smooth, right? They don't have the lines on them that we're going to see in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscles. They're tapered at each end. They are organized in thin sheets. Like I said, we're going to see that there's going to be these striations visible in skeletal and cardiac muscles. Those are called sarcomeres, and smooth muscle cells do not have those visible. They appear smooth, and these are uninucleate, meaning they have a single nucleus. So you just want to recognize that this is what smooth muscle generally looks like. So where do we find smooth muscle? Like I said, this is completely controlled by your autonomic nervous system, so you don't have conscious control of your smooth muscle. So they're going to be, lining the functions of the lungs, blood vessels, right? So your blood vessels dilate and constrict in response to blood pressure changes. Your urinary bladder, think about how it has to stretch and be responsive to increases in urine. the reproductive system as well, the lining of the tubes in the reproductive system. Okay, acetylcholine is released by the parasympathetic neurons, and that stimulates contractions throughout the digestive system. So there is acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter for muscle contraction. It's released by the parasympathetic nervous system when we're talking about smooth muscle. All right, so let's take a look at cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is similar to smooth muscle in that it is involuntary. You're not thinking about controlling your heartbeat. Even though you do have some conscious control of it, you can, but you're not directly consciously controlling your heartbeat. You can notice here in this drawing that there's striations, there's lines in this muscle tissue, which is different than what we see here in the smooth picture. There's also these structures called intercalated discs in between the cells. What these do is these allow for the communication and the jumping of electrical signals from heart cell to heart cell. All right, so those intercalated discs are unique to cardiac tissue, cardiac muscle tissue. We don't see them in any other type of muscle tissue. Okay, so that's an important, distinction when you're looking at this. Am I looking at smooth muscle? Am I looking at cardiac muscle? Am I looking at skeletal? Okay, so like I said, it is involuntary and contracts following these spontaneous depolarizations. So the heart really acts kind of as its own electrical system. It's got its own pacemaker in there that sets the pace, and that allows the heart to really beat without too much influence from other parts of the nervous system. It does, however, have some impact. So acetylcholine from parasympathetic neurons can slow down your heartbeat. And that makes sense, right? When you're in that rest and digest situation, you are slowing down the heartbeat. During exercise, the sympathetic division will kick in, and that'll speed up the heartbeat. Okay, so that means more blood from the heart, essential component of that fight or flight response. So that influence makes sense. But without those influences, the heart will beat pretty steady because of that SA node, which we talked about in a previous lecture, right? It keeps it at kind of like 100 beats per minute, and then your parasympathetic will slow it down to its normal beats per minute or speed it up beyond that. Skeletal muscle, last one here, is made up of unbranched multinucleate muscle fibers, and each fiber is packed with these structures called myofibrils, and those myofibrils are what give it this striated appearance, and we'll talk about this more later, but basically all throughout the skeletal muscle are these repeated patterns, and these repeated patterns are all sarcomeres, and those are the contractile units of skeletal muscle. Okay, and like we said before, this is voluntary, and these contraction of these skeletal muscles will pull on bones to cause movement. So here's an overview of a few of the major muscles, superficial muscles of the body, and you may have seen some of these before, heard of some of these before, especially if you exercise or you lift weights. You got your trapezius, which is the major muscle of the back. You got your deltoid, which is your shoulders. Your chest, which is the pectoralis major. Pectoralis minor is underneath of it. Your biceps brachii is the anterior muscle here. The triceps brachii is the posterior muscle here of the upper arm. Okay, in the back you got the latissimus dorsi as well. You got your abdominal muscles, rectus abdominis, gluteus maximus. Major muscle here cutting across the thigh like a strap is your sartorius. Your quadricep muscle group is made up of the rectus femoris, which is one of them. And in the back you've got your biceps femoris, which is your hamstrings, right? So you can notice that if you look at, it's hard to tell kind of from this top figure, but the biceps has two origins at the top to that muscle. And you can see that the biceps femoris also has two origins at the top, and that's where the term biceps comes from. And then the second word tells you where it is. So biceps brachii is in the brachial region, which is the arm, and biceps femoris is in the femoral region, which is in the leg. Gastrocnemius is the calf muscles, and then the soleus is behind that muscle. The Achilles tendon connects your calcaneal bone to the gastrocnemius. And if you've ever had a Achilles tendon injury or known somebody with that, you know it can be a pretty nasty injury. So we'll kind of focus our discussion in terms of muscle contraction on what's happening with skeletal muscles. So they're voluntary, and they're stimulated then by somatic motor neurons. So somatic means conscious control, motor means movement, so it makes sense that the skeletal muscle would be controlled by this branch of the nervous system. The force of the output of skeletal muscle depends on three things, right? The proportion of the different muscle fiber types, so how many there are, which we're going to see, how those muscle fibers are arranged, and how the muscle is used. So when we see muscle fiber, that term is just another name for a muscle cell. So we use them interchangeably with muscles. So here's a look at the three classes of muscle invertebrates. Invertebrates, not invertebrates. We got smooth muscle, cardiac muscle in the middle, and the skeletal muscle. Just make sure you can recognize the differences, and we've got the major characteristics of the muscle fibers or muscle cells there. So this is one muscle fiber. This is one muscle fiber. Okay, these are muscle fibers, one, two, separated by intercalated discs in cardiac muscle. Okay, so the type of muscle fibers you're going to find are going to depend on what that muscle is doing, what work it's doing. So there's three types, and I've seen these characterized different ways, but these are the way your book kind of describes them. So you've got your slow muscle fibers, and these are going to be red. So slow muscle fibers appear red because there's lots of oxygen in the myoglobin. Okay, so these contract slowly, and they fatigue slowly due to a high concentration of mitochondria. So these slow muscle fibers are going to be used, if you're running a very long race. Okay, you're running a marathon, you're going to be tapping into those slow muscle fibers. Fast twitch or fast muscle fibers are going to appear white because they have a low concentration of myoglobin. So these are going to be really quickly contracting, and they rely on glycolysis as their source of ATP, which is an anaerobic source. So these are used for very fast sprint situations. And then if you're running like a 2 miles, maybe you'd be relying mostly on intermediate muscle fibers. These appear pink and red, and they're intermediate between the two. So they use some ATP from glycolysis and some they obtain ATP from glycolysis and also from aerobic respiration, 50-50. So it just depends on where the muscle is and the needs of the organism at that time, which muscle fibers it's going to rely on. And you can change the amount of these muscle fibers in your body depending on what it is that you do. So someone who is a marathon runner is going to have much more slow muscle fibers than someone who's a sprinter who would have more fast muscle fibers. All right, so here's a look at the three side by side. You got your slow, your fast, and your intermediate, and you can tell the difference, the red, the white, and the pink or red, and that just has to do with how much myoglobin there is. Okay? And it would make sense that your slow fibers, since they're doing a lot of cellular respiration, which we know is for longer pockets of energy, would have many mitochondria, whereas few in fast fibers, and then in the intermediate they also have many mitochondria as well, even though they don't just rely on them. Okay, so these are the terms that I have seen before: slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, fast oxidative glycolytic. All right, so that's where I'm going to end this part one of this lecture today.